My name is Beatrice Montgomery. For 40 of my 62 years, I have lived in Charleston, in a graceful, three-story house south of Broad Street with verandas that catch the sea breeze and a garden that smells of jasmine and salt. My life, much like this city, has been one of quiet rhythms and predictable tides, a slow dance of seasons marked by the blooming of azaleas and the fading of summer light across the harbor. My husband, Arthur, a man whose name is etched onto the brass plaques of half the restored buildings in the historic district, has been the architect of this life, and I, its devoted curator. Our son, Theo, is our greatest work. He has his father's ambition, but my softer heart, a combination that has served him well in building his own life, which includes a string of charming boutique hotels and a wife, Serafina. And so we come to Sunday supper, a tradition as sacred in our home as the chiming of the bells from St. Michael's Church. It was a ritual of connection, a weekly reaffirmation of family. But on this particular evening in late autumn, the air in our dining room, usually warm with the scent of roast chicken and candlelight, felt thin and sharp, charged with an unspoken static. Serafina sat opposite me, a portrait of cool elegance in silk, a stark contrast to the warm mahogany of the table Arthur and I had chosen together on our honeymoon. She had been a whirlwind in our lives, arriving 2 years prior with a tragic story of a Parisian childhood cut short and a fierce ambition to make her name as a gallerist. She was, Arthur often said, exactly what Theo needed, a woman with fire. I, however, had always felt a chill in her presence, a draft from a door I could never quite locate. Throughout the meal, she'd been unervingly still, her usual cascade of opinions and critiques reduced to a faint, knowing smile. It was this quiet that put me on edge more than any of her usual provocations. Then, as the dessert plates were cleared, it came. An envelope. Not a birthday card or a casual note, but a plain, cream-colored business envelope, which she slid across the polished wood. It came to rest beside my water glass with a soundless finality. "I believe this is for you, Beatrice," she said, her voice a polished stone, smooth and cold. Theo looked over, a crease of confusion between his brows. "What is it, Serafina?" Arthur shifted in his chair, the slight scrape of wood on wood echoing in the sudden silence. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting the way the color had drained from his handsome face, the subtle tremor in the hand that rested near his wine glass. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Serafina leaned back, a connoisseur preparing to savor a rare vintage. "I think your mother should see it, since she seems to have a blind spot for what's been happening in her own home." The words were meant to be daggers, and though I felt their points, my expression remained one of gentle curiosity. Inside, my heart was not racing with shock or pain. Instead, it beat with a slow, solemn rhythm, a deep, resonant drum that had been sounding for months. I had been waiting for this. Not for this cruelty, perhaps, but for the moment the curtain would be pulled back on the sad play they had been performing. With hands that felt steady and detached, as if they belonged to someone else, I lifted the flap. The contents slid out onto the damask tablecloth. They were photographs, printed on heavy, glossy paper. Arthur and Serafina. In the guest suite upstairs, the one with the pale blue wallpaper I'd chosen. In a hotel room I didn't recognize, with the clean, impersonal feel of a place designed for anonymity. Arthur and Serafina in his vintage silver Porsche, the one he polished every Saturday, a kiss of shocking intimacy. I drew in a breath, a soft, deliberate gasp. I let a tear, hot and real, trace a path down my cheek. The grief was genuine, but its source was deeper and older than these pictures. "Oh, Arthur," I whispered, my voice breaking with a practiced fragility. "How could you? What in God's name is this?" Theo's voice was a raw wound. He pushed his chair back, standing so abruptly he nearly knocked it over. Arthur finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic cocktail of guilt and, more potently, fear. Good, a small, cold part of me thought. He should be afraid. "Beatrice, I can explain," he began, his voice raspy. Serafina cut him off with a short, sharp laugh. "What is there to explain? Your father and I have found something real. Something alive. And we're tired of hiding it." The silence that fell was profound, a vacuum that sucked all the warmth from the room. Theo stared at his wife, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "You're my wife," he stammered, his gaze shifting to his father. "And she's your daughter-in-law. This is monstrous." "Love is never monstrous, Theo," Serafina said, shrugging as if discussing the weather. "Your father appreciates things you can't yet understand. Passion. Depth." I watched my son's face crumble. I saw the precise moment his world fractured, and a fierce, maternal rage I hadn't felt in years rose in my chest. I pushed it down. "Not yet." The timing had to be perfect. "How long?" I asked, my voice a thread of sound. "About a year," Serafina said with a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Time flies when you're truly happy." A year. She was lying, of course. I knew it had been closer to 18 months. I had been tracking their quiet betrayals, their secret currents, almost from the beginning. Arthur, for all his brilliance in architecture, had never been able to construct a convincing lie. The sudden business trips to Savannah, the new, expensive cologne, the way he'd started talking about feeling young again. And Serafina, well, Serafina believed she was the smartest person in any room she entered, a flaw that had ultimately become her undoing. "I think," I said, rising slowly from my chair, "I need some air." "Mom," Theo started, reaching for me, but I waved him away with a trembling hand. "Just a moment, darling. I just need to process this." I walked toward the kitchen, my steps intentionally unsteady. But instead of going out to the garden, I stopped in the butler's pantry, just out of sight, where the shadows concealed me but the acoustics were perfect. This was the moment of truth, when the players, thinking the wounded party had left the stage, reveal their true motives. Was that really necessary? I heard Theo say, his voice thick with unshed tears. "To be so cruel?" "Oh, grow up, Theo," Serafina retorted. "Your mother has been sleepwalking through her life for decades. I did her a favor. A wake-up call." "A favor?" Theo's voice cracked. "You obliterated my parents' marriage. You obliterated our marriage." "Your parents' marriage was a museum piece, beautiful but lifeless," Serafina said dismissively. "And ours? It was a means to an end, darling. A stepping stone." I heard Arthur clear his throat, a weak, sputtering sound. "Serafina, perhaps we should." "Should what, Arthur?" she snapped. "Pretend? Go back to sneaking around? I'm done with that. I'm tired of being a secret." "You're a parasite," Theo said, his voice low and shaking with rage. I felt a surge of pride. He was my son, after all. "Be careful, Theo." Serafina's tone turned venomous. "You might want to consider who holds the power here. Arthur told me all about that little structural issue with the foundation at the Monarch, your flagship hotel. It would be a shame if the city inspectors got an anonymous tip, wouldn't it? Your reputation would be ruined." My blood ran cold. She was threatening my son. My Theo. That changed everything. This was no longer just about infidelity. It was about destruction. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers sure and steady as I opened the folder I had labeled Orchid, a flower known for its beauty, its exotic allure, and its complex needs. 18 months of quiet observation, of patient research, of sleepless nights spent piecing together a puzzle I never wanted to solve. It was all there. Taking a deep, cleansing breath, I walked back into the dining room. 3 pairs of eyes snapped towards me. Serafina was still wearing that smug, predatory smile. "You know, Serafina," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the Ashley River at dawn. "You're right about one thing. I have been blind to what was happening in my own house." Her smile widened. Finally. A little honesty. "Yes," I agreed, stepping closer to her, my phone held discreetly in my hand. "Finally." I turned the screen toward her. "And speaking of honesty, I believe this belongs to you." The screen did not show a photograph. It showed a high-resolution scan of a legal document. A marriage certificate from the state of Georgia, dated 5 years ago. Serafina's face went bone white. The name on the certificate was not Serafina Dubois. It was Victoria Croft. And the groom was not Theo. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "His name is Marcus Croft," I said gently. I believe he's a shipping magnate from Savannah. Or at least he was. Does that name ring any bells, Victoria? Her wine glass, forgotten in her hand, slipped from her fingers and shattered on the heart pine floor. The deep red wine spread across the old wood like a pooling wound. That's impossible, she breathed. Is it? I asked, swiping to the next image, a recent photo of a handsome, weary-looking man standing on the Savannah riverfront. Because Marcus is very much alive. And according to him, and the state of Georgia, you are still very much his wife. And then, like one of Arthur's meticulously designed buildings hit by a wrecking ball, Serafina's, Victoria's carefully constructed world imploded. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the floor in a heap of silk and deceit. As I looked down at her unconscious form, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a profound, aching sadness. The storm had finally broken, but I knew the most difficult work, clearing the wreckage, was just beginning. 18 months earlier, the first thread had come loose. It wasn't a shocking text message or a lipstick-stained collar. It was subtler than that. It was an entry on a credit card statement I happened to see on Arthur's desk. A charge for over $5,000 from a high-end jeweler in Atlanta, a store we'd never frequented. A gift for me, I'd assumed, for our upcoming anniversary. But our anniversary came and went, and no such gift appeared. When I asked him about it, he'd waved it away. An investment, he'd said vaguely. Something Serafina is looking into for her gallery. But the explanation felt hollow, ill-fitting. Arthur was meticulous about finances. He didn't make vague investments. He designed, he planned, he executed. That was the first tug. Soon, others followed. A weekend trip he took to Savannah for a historical preservation conference that I could find no record of online. The way he and Serafina would fall silent when I entered a room, a shared glance passing between them that was too intimate, too conspiratorial. I started to feel like a ghost in my own life, a silent observer of a narrative from which I was being slowly erased. I am not a technologically savvy woman by nature, but grief and suspicion are powerful motivators. I started with Serafina. Serafina Dubois, the name she'd given us. I searched for her online gallery, for articles about her Parisian past, for any digital footprint that would corroborate her story. I found nothing. It was as if she had been born the day she met my son. This was when I knew I needed help. But a private investigator felt so tawdry, so beneath the quiet dignity I had always tried to maintain. Instead, I sought out Ms. Evelyn Reed, a retired librarian and local historian whom I'd known for years through my volunteer work. Evelyn had a mind like a steel trap and a genealogist's passion for uncovering hidden truths. Over tea in her cluttered, book-lined sitting room, I told her everything, my voice low and trembling. I wasn't just a wife suspecting an affair. I was a mother terrified for her son. Evelyn listened, her shrewd, kind eyes never leaving my face. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply said, "Let me see what I can find, Beatrice." It took her 3 weeks. She didn't use clandestine methods, just her deep knowledge of public records, archives, and the interconnectedness of old Southern families. The woman she brought back to me was not Serafina Dubois. Her name was Victoria Croft, née Sawyer. She wasn't from Paris. She was from a small, forgotten town in rural Georgia. And she was, indeed, still legally married to Marcus Croft of the Savannah Crofts, a family whose shipping fortune had mysteriously collapsed 4 years prior. "It's a pattern, Beatrice," Evelyn said, her voice gentle as she laid out the documents on her coffee table. "She's done this twice before that I can confirm. She finds a wealthy, established family, usually one with a son of marriageable age. She invents a tragic, romantic backstory. She embeds herself, marries the son, and then, through a combination of charm and manipulation, begins to systematically dismantle the family's finances. It's not just about cheating, my dear. This is a profession." I stared at the marriage certificate, the property records, the newspaper clippings about the Croft family's downfall. I felt a nausea so profound it almost buckled me. She wasn't just sleeping with my husband. She was planning to devour my family from the inside out. "There's more," Evelyn said softly. "Marcus Croft. He never believed she died in that boating accident she supposedly had. He's been looking for her. A boating accident. The lie was as audacious as it was cruel. Can you arrange a meeting? I asked, my voice surprisingly firm. I think Mr. Croft and I have a great deal to discuss. 2 days later, I found myself on a bench in one of Savannah's shaded, historic squares, the air thick with the scent of magnolias. When Marcus Croft approached, I recognized him from the photos, but in person, the weariness was etched into his features, a permanent part of his handsome face. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Beatrice," I said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." For the next 2 hours, under the dappled light of the live oaks, he told me his story. He spoke of the brilliant, captivating woman named Victoria who had swept into his life, how he'd fallen for her stories of being a war orphan raised by nuns, how she'd made him feel like a hero. She didn't just take the money, he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the fountain in the center of the square. She took my confidence, my trust in my own judgment. She convinced me to make a series of disastrous investments, to sign over power of attorney. She even took my grandmother's pearls. And then one day, she was gone. A boating trip. A capsized vessel. No body ever found. Did you go to the police? He gave a bitter laugh. They saw a grieving husband and a series of bad business deals. Legally, I had given her everything. There was nothing to prosecute. It was my word against a ghost's. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. His pain was a living thing, palpable in the humid air between us. "What if I told you," I said slowly, "that the ghost has reappeared? And that this time, we might be able to stop her?" For the first time since he'd sat down, a flicker of light appeared in Marcus Croft's haunted eyes. "What do you have in mind?" As I explained my slow, patient plan, I watched hope begin to bloom in the barren landscape of that man's face. And for the first time since finding that jewelry receipt, I felt something other than sorrow and fear. I felt the first stirrings of my own strength, a force I had long forgotten I possessed. The morning after my meeting with Marcus, I confronted Arthur. I found him in his study, a room paneled in dark wood, filled with architectural models of the buildings that had made his name. He was sketching on a drafting table, a man entirely absorbed in his world of lines and angles. "Arthur, we need to talk," I said from the doorway. He looked up, startled. The familiar mask of benign neglect was in place, but I could see the panic flickering in his eyes. "Beatrice, is everything all right?" "No, Arthur, it isn't," I said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me. I sat in one of the leather armchairs facing his desk. "I want you to tell me about Victoria Croft." The name landed in the quiet room like a detonated bomb. The pencil fell from his hand, rolling across the blueprint he'd been working on. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sallow, frightened pallor. I don't know who you're talking about." "Don't you?" I asked, my voice quiet but unyielding. "The woman who calls herself Serafina. The woman who has been blackmailing you for the last 18 months. He finally broke, burying his face in his hands. "How did you know?" he whispered, his shoulders shaking. "Tell me," I said. It was not a request. And so, the squalid truth came out, tumbling into the elegant, orderly space of his study. It began 20 years ago, with a downtown restoration project. To meet a deadline and a budget, Arthur had approved the use of substandard structural steel. No one had ever discovered it. The building stood, beautiful and celebrated. But a disgruntled former employee had kept the records, the invoices, the proof. That employee had died, and his daughter had inherited his files. His daughter, Victoria. "She came to me," Arthur choked out. "She had everything. She said she'd expose me, ruin my reputation, and my career. Everything I've built." "So you made a deal with the devil," I said, feeling not anger, but a vast, weary emptiness. "She said all she wanted was an introduction into Charleston society. A way in. She targeted Theo. She said if I helped her, if I made her seem legitimate, she'd keep my secret. I thought I could manage it." "And the affair?" I asked, the question clinical, detached. He couldn't look at me. That wasn't part of the plan. She makes a man feel seen, desired. I was weak. I was afraid, Beatrice. I was a coward. I looked at my husband, the man I had loved and respected for 4 decades, and saw a stranger, a man shrunken by his own secrets. You are willing to sacrifice our son's happiness to save your own reputation. To save us, he protested, looking up, his eyes pleading. If I was ruined, we would have lost everything. The house, our standing. I was trying to protect our life. Our life, Arthur, I said, standing up, was an illusion long before Victoria Croft arrived. You just gave her the keys to the front door. I walked to the door. You have a choice to make. You can continue to let her control you, or you can help me protect our son and what's left of this family. He stared at me, dumbfounded. What are you planning to do? I'm planning, I said, to remodel. Through Evelyn, I was put in touch with a detective in the Charleston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Harding was a quiet, methodical man who had, it turned out, been tracking whispers of a long-firm con artist targeting families along the coast for years. He'd heard of Victoria, but had never been able to make a case stick. Her victims were always too compromised or too ashamed to testify. You're in a unique position, Mrs. Montgomery, he'd explained in his Spartan office. You know the truth, but she still sees you as a powerless victim. We believe if you confront her, she might incriminate herself. She'll be arrogant. She won't believe you're a threat. The plan was dangerous, but it was also the only way. And so, the stage was set for that final Sunday supper. I was wired with a tiny recording device. Detective Harding and his team were parked in an unmarked van just down the street, listening to every word. I had insisted it happen in my home. This was my ground, my territory. The battle would be fought and won here. After Serafina, Victoria collapsed after the initial shock and Theo's frantic call to 911 was intercepted by Detective Harding's team who came through the door. The truth finally came out. Theo learned of his father's betrayal and his wife's treachery in the same devastating blow. The aftermath was a quiet storm. Victoria was arrested, her confession captured on tape, irrefutable. It was enough to connect her to Marcus Croft's case and 2 others. The legal battle would be long, but her career as a con artist was over. The damage to my family, however, was incalculable. 6 months later, I stand on the veranda of my new home. It's a carriage house, tucked away behind a curtain of wisteria on a quiet side street. I sold the grand house on Broad Street. It was too full of ghosts and the echoes of a life that no longer fit. The air here is just as sweet, the light just as golden. But it is all mine. Arthur and I are divorced. The process was quiet, civilized. He lives in a modern condo overlooking the water, a place of glass and steel, a world away from the historic preservation he dedicated his life to. He is a man facing his own reckoning. As part of a plea deal for his cooperation in Victoria's case, he publicly admitted to the structural issues in his long-ago project and is now dealing with the lawsuits and the ruin of his professional legacy. He is finally, in his own way, taking responsibility. We speak sometimes, brief, careful calls. There is no anger left, only a shared history and a profound sadness for what was lost. My relationship with Theo, however, has been reborn. In the ashes of our old family, we found a new, more honest connection. The betrayal shattered him, but it did not break him. He sold his interest in the hotel with the faulty foundation, unwilling to live with the lie. He has started a new, smaller venture, one built on integrity from the ground up. He and Marcus Croft have become unlikely friends, and together they are creating a foundation to provide legal and emotional support to victims of romance and financial fraud. They are turning their pain into a purpose. He visits me every Sunday. We don't have formal suppers anymore. We have coffee on my small veranda, or we work together in my garden. He brought me an orchid yesterday. It's supposed to be hard to get to rebloom, he said. I thought you'd be up for the challenge. I have returned to a long-lost love, botanical illustration. My small house is filled with light, with pots of ink and watercolor palettes, and with detailed, loving portraits of the flora of the Low Country. I spend my days in the garden or walking along the Battery, sketchbook in hand, truly seeing the world around me for the first time in years. At 62, I have enrolled in a Master Gardener program at the College of Charleston. I am learning that boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but lines that define where you end and another person begins. I am learning that self-respect is the foundation upon which any happy life must be built. I am learning that strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think of Victoria. I see her in my mind's eye, a creature of brilliant, destructive energy, and I feel a strange sort of pity for her. To spend one's life constructing facades, never knowing the peace of being truly seen or loved for who you are, must be the loneliest existence of all. She taught me a terrible, valuable lesson, that the illusions we cling to can become our prisons. The sun is setting, casting a warm, golden glow over my garden. The bells of St. Michael's begin to chime, their familiar song drifting on the evening breeze. It is a sound that once marked the rhythm of a life I thought was mine. Now it marks the rhythm of a life I am consciously, joyfully, and bravely creating for myself. I am Beatrice Montgomery, and for the first time, I am the sole architect of my own existence. I am finally home.